coming to you from Charlottesville, Virginia, where it's a beautiful day, and I'm pleased to be with you all to tell you about editing stories. Why don't we go ahead and jump right into it? If you have questions along the way, please put them in the chat, and Elise will monitor them for me. Okay, well, I want to begin with the obvious, which is that all of us want all students to thrive. Something we of course all share. But there are obstacles in our way that I'm sure all of you are quite familiar with. That there's many educational challenges of students living in poverty, underfunding of schools, classes that are too large, lack of student preparedness, and of course the pandemic, which has introduced all sorts of barriers to student achievement. Now, to address those, traditionally, I think we have done this in one of two ways. One is to try to address something in the student. So that's the red circle you see on the screen. We try to address the students' skills, their motivation, their grit, their health as a way to help them achieve. Or, in addition, we might address things about the environment, try to address poverty, underfunding, class size, all of those things. And of course, we need both of these approaches. But what I'm going to talk about today is a different one, and I refer to it as the social psychological approach. That's my field. I'm a social psychologist. And the assumption we make is that you need to get inside the student's head and see how they represent or interpret themselves and the situation. What kind of stories do they tell themselves about their role in school, why they're achieving at the level they are, and so on. I will draw an analogy to perceiving the external world, that what you see here is the classic duck-rabbit optical illusion, where some of you may see this as a duck looking off in this direction, others as a rabbit looking off in that direction. And which is it objectively? Well, it's neither. It's how you interpret it. It's what's inside your head. And really the point I want to make is the same is true in education as to how students represent their environment and themselves. Now, I'll use the word stories, but I just want to be clear that this is really a kind of an analogy. There are other terms that mean pretty much the same thing, some of which you may be familiar with: mindsets, attributions, interpretations, narratives. The one that social psychologists are particularly fond of, construals. But they all are trying to get at seeing the world through the student's eyes and seeing how that student represents the world they are in. Now, one point I really want to emphasize is that, of course, the objective world matters. I am certainly not arguing that all educational problems are in the head of the student. We do need to increase funding for schools and reduce class size and et cetera. No doubt about that. But what I hope to convey today is that people's stories matter as well. And there are ways we can address that to change those stories for the better. Now, again, just to illustrate that, imagine these 4 students are in the same class and they've all run into some sort of problem they can't solve. Maybe it's a math class, maybe it's an English class, it doesn't matter. It's just they're all sort of puzzled. And the question is, what's going to happen next? Are they going to learn what they are struggling with? And really the basic point is that how they explain this to themselves, the story they tell will matter a lot as to what happens next. And these stories can sometimes go wrong. Even 2 students in the same environment can have very different interpretations of why they are struggling. And I'm sure these kinds of stories are familiar to you. The student who says, I'm not a math person. The one who says, maybe I don't belong here. Or, people like me of my gender or racial group or background aren't valued here. or this class is irrelevant to me. It has nothing to do with what I'm interested in. These are all little stories that students could tell that could have damaging effects. It could lead to them giving up and not trying as hard as they might, for example. And social psychologists over the past several years have developed interventions to try to change these stories to help students achieve. And as you'll see, these interventions, several of them have long-lasting positive outcomes. So today I want to give you some examples of these interventions. I'll give you 4 basic kinds of examples. Just a side note, they've also been called WISE interventions, but they're all theory-based. I do want to emphasize that too. If you have a background in psychology, you may have heard of some of these theories of attribution theory, cognitive dissonance theory, utility value theory. If not, doesn't really matter for today's purposes, but you should know that the interventions I'll present to you weren't invented out of thin air. They were based on psychological theory. So I'll begin with telling you about a study I did many years ago when I first got out of graduate school. And it's what kind of got me into this area. And from then I'll sort of fast forward to the future to give you some more recent examples. But as a college instructor, I was struck with the kind of maladaptive stories students could tell themselves when they were struggling. So let's take an example of this student who fails her first college test. And this is a story she might tell herself. She might say, just proves that I can't make it here, that I'm one of those people who's not cut out for college. Maybe I was one of those admission errors you always hear about. And if she tells herself that story, turn on my pen here. So if this is what she says, that's going to have some negative consequences. She won't try as hard. She'll experience stress. And that will reinforce this idea by leading to further bad grades. If she thinks she can't make it here, she'll give up, she won't study as hard, and she won't finish, she won't get good grades. And that can actually reinforce the original attribution she has made. So this is a damaging exacerbation cycle that feeds on itself and makes things worse. But imagine this student who is in the exact same class and gets the exact same failing grade on her first test. Notice that she has a different kind of interpretation. She says to herself, okay, this is bad, but I'm okay. This is a sign I need to try a different strategy, work harder, maybe go to the professor's office hours. And that more hopeful attribution will lead to her trying harder, and she doesn't experience as much stress as the first student. That pays off with good grades because she does try harder and find other strategies, and that reinforces this more positive attribution. So this is a self-enhancing strategy. And it struck us that maybe we could take students like the one who has the negative story and nudge them into the more positive story. And we did that in a very simple way. Our participants were first-year college students who weren't doing well academically. And we invited them into our laboratory for a psychology study. We never told them we were trying to improve their academic performance or that they were chosen because they were doing poorly. They thought they were just taking part in the survey. And as part of this, we gave them some results of a prior survey we had done that said, actually a lot of students struggle at first in college, but things get better. And we showed them some brief videotaped interviews of older students who reinforced this, who said, yeah, my first semester was rough, but I learned the ropes and things got better. And that was pretty much it. It took about 30 minutes. We had a randomly assigned control group that also came in but got some information unrelated to academic performance. So, in some ways this was embarrassingly simple, but we thought we might, take these people who were about to go down the negative story path and nudge them into the positive one, give them more hope and let them try harder. So we sat back to see what would happen, and we found after a year that indeed the people who were in the intervention group had done better academically than those in our control group. What you see here on this y-axis is a difference score between their, on a 4-point scale, of their grades in their second semester of their freshman year minus their first semester. So you see the people in the control group were doing about the same, not very well, in the ensuing semester, but the people in the intervention group were doing a little better. You know, it's not like we turned C students into A students, but this was a reliable result based on a 30-minute intervention. Something that, another positive result that we didn't anticipate that surprised us is those who chose to drop out was pretty high in our control group. 25% of students had dropped out of college by a year later, but that was only about 5% in the intervention group. So, you know, some evidence that this small intervention change people's stories in ways that at least we think were self-perpetuating. That it seems like a small intervention, but it hopefully change people's stories in a way that reinforce themselves, that once they decided, hey, I can make it here, I need to just try a little harder and get some help, that reinforced that positive story and then build on itself in a self-perpetuating way. So a lot of water has gone over the dam since then. That was a long time ago. And there are 4 kinds of interventions that are going on today that I want to give you examples of. Mindset interventions, belonging, values affirmations, and utility values. So let me, I'm going to give an example of research in each of these 4. So the first one is one I bet most of you have heard of. It's based on Carol Dweck's best-selling book, Mindset. And this is the idea that people's stories about their own intelligence are really important. That it's much better to have a growth mindset, that intelligence is something that that builds and like a muscle we can strengthen, as opposed to a fixed mindset that is just something we're born with. And there's a lot of research on this. You know, one of the most recent exciting studies was unusual in its scope, that they did an intervention that was delivered in computers classrooms to 9th graders in 65 representative schools in America. And in these 2 sessions, people got a module teaching them to have a growth mindset. This was a well-controlled study where there was a control group that was randomly assigned to get a filler message, nothing about growth mindsets. And then they wanted to see what effect that had on grades. And one thing they found is this didn't change the grades of high-performing students, because presumably they didn't need the help. They were already doing well and probably had a growth mindset. But those who were not doing well, it did actually, those who got the growth mindset intervention did improve their grades. Now, again, these are not magic bullets. It's not like suddenly the student who was failing was becoming an honor student. The improvement was modest, but it was the result of a very cheap and cost-effective intervention that just took 2 sessions. Now, there's a former graduate student of mine who has followed up on this in an interesting way, Nick Buttrick. And he has, and others have identified what they call a false growth mindset, that it can be actually dangerous for students or teachers to hold. And this is the idea that only effort matters, that anyone who tries can do well. And that's not what Carol Dweck means by a growth mindset. And it's a little dangerous to have that view, because if a student doesn't do well, it can lead to blaming that student. Oh, you're just not trying hard enough. And what I think Dweck really means is what's called a true growth mindset, that success results not just from effort, but learning new strategies, seeking help, finding mentors. It's a much broader idea than just trying. And what my former student, Nick Buttrick, did, he went back to that national study I told you about, and he was able, they had data from the teachers in those schools, and he was able to classify the teachers according to whether they held the false growth mindset that only effort matters, or the true growth mindset that there's a lot of things you can do to improve, seeking help and so on. And once he identified which group these teachers were in, they looked at this performance of the students in those classes, and they found that the teachers who had the false growth mindset, their students were actually achieving at a lower level than were the students who had teachers who had a true growth mindset. Now, this is a correlational finding. You know, we can't tell whether the causal direction here, but it's at least suggestive that having this false growth mindset can be a dangerous thing, and not, these teachers were not serving their students well. Okay, there's a lot of exciting work going on addressing stories about belonging. And the idea is that there are some students who are at risk for feeling that they don't belong. Two groups that have been looked at in particular are minority students and majority white schools. Also first-generation college students, two groups that are historically underrepresented, and once they get to college or high school, as you'll see, they may feel this is not a welcoming environment. And that can lead to a negative cycle of thought that hurts their performance. So a study that was done by Greg Walton and Jeff Cohen a number of years ago was at the college level. I'll tell you about one at the high school level in a moment. But their participants were white and black first-year students at a selective majority white college. And again, it was one of these seemingly brief storytelling interventions. They brought students in and they had them read survey results that from older students saying, yeah, you know, at first when I got to college, I felt like I didn't belong, but then I adjusted and now things are fine. The participants also wrote essays about how their experiences were similar to the older students they had just read about. And they were asked to give a videotaped speech that would be shown to future students that reinforce this message. And this is based on theoretical principles that saying is believing. Getting people to give this message to others is a way to get them to incorporate it themselves. There was a control group, again, randomly assigned. And this took about an hour in the first year, the first semester of college of these students. And again, the idea was to hope that they've caught people at a point where they can nudge them into a better story about any feelings they were having about not belonging. And the results were remarkable. First of all, there were no effects of this intervention on white students, which is what they anticipated, that white students presumably weren't as at risk for feeling they didn't belong in this college. The idea was this intervention would particularly be effective with black students who historically weren't welcome at institutions like this. And so the results I'm going to show you now are just for the black students. And this is the grades they had on a 4-point scale in their senior year, 3 years after the intervention. And you see that those who got the belonging intervention here were doing significantly better. Again, this is not, you know, a hugely large effect, but it was a reliable one. Interestingly, there was some evidence that they were healthier if they got this intervention, that they had gone to the doctor fewer times in the past month. They reported that they were happier if they got the intervention. And these researchers are still following these students. And the most recent results they've published are 7 to 11 years after getting this 1-hour intervention. And the group that did is still happier than those who did not. And they also report more career satisfaction and success. So again, it kind of seems magical. 1 hour has these effects that last 7 to 11 years later. But the theory, at least, is that it nudges people into a self-perpetuating cycle of thought, that it gets them out of this exacerbation cycle, which can spiral people downwards, and gives them a better story that allows them to spiral upwards. Well, a graduate student of mine, Lee Williams, was curious as to whether a similar intervention would work with high schoolers. And he thought, as I'm sure many of you know, a difficult transition is the one from middle school to high school. And is it possible that there are some particularly underrepresented groups who feel like they don't belong and are at the same risk as the college students in the previous study? So he got the cooperation of a local high school to do an intervention with 9th graders. And it was done during, at the end of the summer, the students attended an orientation session, and they were randomly assigned to an intervention or control group. The intervention was similar to the one in the study I just told you. They actually saw a video of older students from that school talking about how it was kind of tough to adjust to high school, but things got better. A common theme that came up was they didn't have anyone to sit with at lunch and they felt lost, but that eventually they made friends and things got much better. And the participants, again, did this seeing is believing exercise. In this case, they wrote a letter to a future 9th grader conveying the message they had just heard about. And again, there was a randomly assigned control group that got an unrelated message. And once again, as expected, this had few effects with white students, but it did have a positive effect with minority students. At the end of their 9th grade year on the 4-point scale, the minority students who got this 1 hour intervention were doing better academically. And they had failed fewer courses. So in the control group, they failed 15% of their courses on average, but that dropped to just about 5% in the case of those who got this 1 hour intervention.
Dr. Wilson, can I ask a question real quickly?
Sure.
For those 2 studies, the videos that were shown, the 9th graders and the freshmen, were they videos of both white students and students of color sharing about not feeling belonging?
That's a really good question. And, there's some debate amongst researchers as what the ideal composition is. But in both cases, there was a mixture of students. So it wasn't just Black or just white students. The one with the high school, it was about 6 or so students giving brief stories. And it was a mixture of gender and background. And we don't know for sure how important that is, but my hunch is showing that this is a common problem is important, not just experienced by one group. Good question. Okay, values affirmation is an intervention that was developed to address what's called stereotype threat. Again, something some of you may have heard of, work by Claude Steele. And the idea here is that if you're a minority student for whom there's a negative stereotype about your group, that you can't do as well as others, that you're kind of at double jeopardy. If you're struggling academically, you of course care about your own performance, as everyone does, but you also care that you might be confirming a negative stereotype about your group, which gives an added amount of stress and can make it, ironically, harder to do well. And this has been addressed with what are called value affirmation interventions, which is a mouthful to describe a really simple thing, where students write brief essays. They're given a list of values and interests, and they're asked to choose 1 or 2 that are important to them and to write about why it's important. And these include things like their families, their religion, interests they might have in music or sports or what have you. And the idea is that kind of reminding themselves that they have values that are really important to them outside of school actually kind of lowers the heat about stereotype threat and makes it easier to perform in school. So in this intervention was done with seventh graders, and they were randomly assigned to write this values affirmation essay or to a control group that didn't. Sometimes it was done just once. There were various versions of this study. Sometimes they did this 2 or 3 times during the fall semester. An important detail is the teachers didn't know which group students were in. So the students, there was nothing in the minds of the teachers that differed. This was just what was in the minds of the students themselves as to whether they had done this values affirmation exercise. Once again, this particular intervention was thought to work with people who were at risk for stereotype threat, Black students in this case. And indeed, it did not have any effect with the white students. But it did, like these other studies, improve the grades of the African-American students. I don't have a graph for this one, but again, they're following these students in this study. They're now in college, and if memory serves, and they're continuing to do better than many of them are in college. In fact, more students in this intervention group went to college than in the control group. And another one that seems magical, and yet the idea is that if you catch people at the right time and can nudge them into a better narrative, this can have really long-lasting effects. Okay, the last one is what's called a utility value intervention, something for those of you who are teachers, I'm sure you've heard some students say this, is what does this material have to do with me? You know, if you're a math teacher, you know, what does algebra have to do with me? I'm never going to use this. Well, these researchers, 2 social psychologists, thought that can be an impediment to learning. It's a form of a story that disengages students, and maybe it can help if we get students to connect the dots and see how relevant this material can be to their everyday lives. And so they took 9th graders in science classes and randomly assigned them to write every few weeks either about the usefulness of the course material to their own lives. So they were just asked to think about ways what they were learning was relevant to what their everyday lives. That's called a utility value intervention, or to a control condition where they just summarized the course material. And again, the teachers didn't know which group the students were in. And they had a prior measure of how engaged students were in the class. And once again, they felt, well, if a student already is engaged, then this extra boost probably won't make much have an effect. And indeed, that was true. But if you looked at the students who started out feeling disengaged and had low expectations as to how they were going to do in this class, the intervention did improve their grades. So here you see, again, the 4-point grade scale. And these were the students who wrote the utility value essays, connecting the dots as to how this was relevant to their everyday lives. And by the end of the year in these classes, they had improved compared to the control group fairly substantially in this case. Now, what do all these have in common? First of all, I do think they show that stories do matter, that what these interventions all were addressing is how students view themselves and their environment. Second, that you can redirect these stories successfully with fairly minimal interventions based on social psychological theory in ways that are self-sustaining. Now, in a moment, I'm going to get to what we don't understand about this, and I think this is the theory that it leads to these self-sustaining changes, but we could use more evidence for that. But one thing I do want to emphasize too is that all of the studies I've told you about were well-designed experiments where that were RCTs, randomized controlled trials, in which there were good control conditions with random assignment. And all too often, I think we do educational interventions without testing them properly, which is kind of a shtick of mine that we're too ready to implement interventions that we haven't tested well. And just for the fun of it, again, just what I said, that what we mean by good evidence is really this gold standard of randomized controlled trials where you have a control group. This, I don't mean to imply this is easy, and it can raise issues of, is it right to not give the intervention to a control group? Is that ethical to withhold a treatment from one group? And my answer is you have to start that way because you don't know that your intervention is effective. Just like with a trial of a new drug, we wouldn't just give the drug to everyone. We have to test it first to see if it has an effect. And so we have a control group that doesn't get it. But the same is true of any educational intervention. And if it does prove effective, then you give it more broadly, but you need to take that first step. And just to illustrate a few programs that I think you've probably heard of that were instituted before they were tested properly. And as it turns out, once they were tested with randomized control designs, it turns out they didn't work. In some cases, actually backfire. I don't know how many of you have the DARE drug program in your schools, but both of my kids went through this. In its original version, not only did it not work, there's some evidence that actually increased drug use in kids, believe it or not. Scared Straight, I bet you've all heard of, where you take kids to prisons and scare the bejesus out of them to get them out of a life of crime. There are TV shows about this, documentary films. It took a while for psychologists to test this with good designs, but guess what? It actually increases criminal behavior. We don't know exactly why, but not only does this not work, it actually does the exact opposite of what we want it to do. Critical incident stress management is an intervention to help people who have experienced trauma, where you come in right away and get them to relive the trauma as best they can. It was used in New York after 9/11 with people who witnessed these horrible events. 9/11, but doesn't work. In fact, there's some evidence that actually makes memories, it makes the traumas worse in some cases. So again, this is my shtick to make sure we test things properly. But back to these kind of interventions, I do want to say a little bit about where we are now and where you can get more information about these if you want. There are many more of these kinds of interventions than I've had time to tell you about. Many of them have been replicated. Occasionally there are failures to replicate some of them, and I think it's these are ongoing questions that we don't know all the answers to, but research, that's why we keep doing studies. Of the ones I told you about, I would say the one I think we probably understand the least is the values affirmation, where people pick a value they really care about and write about it. I'm convinced it can work. There are enough replications of it, but there have been some failures to replicate, and we're still sorting out exactly what's going on with that one. And again, I do think we need more work that looks at exactly why these interventions work. I've told you why I think they work, that they nudge people into a different story that becomes self-perpetuating. And there's a little bit of evidence for that from some of the studies. So the one on belonging that was done in college, They had the students, after they took part in this 1 hour intervention, fill out some daily diaries for a couple of weeks where they talked about their experiences in college. And from looking at those diary entries, which they had permission to share with the researchers, it did look like those who got the intervention were telling themselves different things about belonging. So, for example, they might say, you know, it's Friday and it's Friday night and I don't have anything to do. No one's invited me out to see a movie or anything. I'm feeling kind of lonely. But that doesn't mean, you know, maybe I need to try harder to make friends. This doesn't mean that, you know, I don't belong here. They seem to incorporate the message they heard from the intervention into their daily lives. But again, there's a lot more work that needs to be done to look at that. Exactly when do these interventions work? Again, I want to emphasize that the problems are not just in the students' heads, that obviously the objective situation matters. And it's more than likely that these kind of interventions are going to work better in some contexts than others. So some of the researchers are quite clear about this. They say, you know, just because we make a student feel like they belong, it has to be a welcoming environment. If it's a really hostile environment where they in fact don't belong, we may be doing them a disservice to convince them that they do. So there have to be welcoming environments that where people can succeed. But then it's in those kind of environments that these interventions are apt to be most effective. But again, there's lots of work that needs to be done to sort out exactly when these interventions will work. You may have noticed that all of the interventions I talked about started kind of small. With the exception of the mindset one that was done in 65 different schools, these were small-scale studies done as kind of tests of the effectiveness of the intervention with, you know, one group of ninth graders in one school. And that raises the issue of, you know, can we generalize this to other schools and how do we scale them up? And as I was saying, you know, will these interventions work in every single context? And I think surely the answer to that is no, that we need to understand better when they'll work and when they won't. There are obviously practical issues with scaling up these interventions. I mean, I think all of them are scalable in the sense that it is, in theory, one could deliver these interventions on a much broader scale, but there are practical issues in getting schools to do this and to maintaining the fidelity of the interventions. Getting the funding to do it is always an issue. So, you know, the short message here is lots of work to be done. But I do want to say a little bit about where, if any of you are interested in this kind of approach, where you can get more information. This is my only plug for my book, Redirect, that I'll give you. And you know, I use some educational examples in this book, but it's really more broadly about these kind of interventions for other kind of social issues and problems. So don't go to this thinking it's just about education, because it's not. But if you're interested in the educational applications of these, and even how your schools might take advantage of them, I'll point you in 3 different directions. One is called PERTS, the Project for Educational Research That Scales. And this is an interesting project started by some researchers at Stanford that partners with schools to test out new interventions and see if they work. So schools agreed to do this as a research project, but then the researchers give you options of things you might want to try in your school. There's a lot of cool things going on there. There's something called the Student Experience Network. It's mostly dealing with the kind of Carol Dweck mindset approach, but it's broader than that. And there's a lot of resources there. If you're interested in current research, there's a lot of listing of current studies there. And lastly, a psychologist at Stanford named Greg Walton has a searchable database where you can go, if you're interested in this kind of approach, and enter search words that will tell you, give you the actual research studies that have been done in this area. I think we have enough time that I will just quickly show you those websites. Actually, I need to share my screen again to do that. So let me get out of my PowerPoint. And get this down. There we go. So yeah, this is the PERCH website that has opportunities for both various levels of education and different kinds of interventions, some of which I've mentioned, some of which I haven't. This is the Student Experience Research Network, and if you click on Research and Resources, there's lots of cool resources available there. And the last one, this database where you can type in search words and it tells you what research has been done. So I will stop there, and I am more than happy to answer any questions you might have.
Feel free to type any questions in the chat, and I will make sure
I'm curious whether this resonated for those of you who are teachers with your own experiences, or educators more generally. Yes, I see that. Let me share my screen. Get to my PowerPoints. So these are the four I talked about: mindset, interventions, belonging, values affirmation, and utility value.
I'm curious, Dr. Wilson, do you know of any places where this is being done on a larger scale, any of these interventions?
Well, you know, the one I'm most familiar with is the National Mindset Study. I mean, that was an amazing project. It was not trivial to get 65 schools in America to agree to do this and to implement it faithfully. It was not cheap. They got a lot of funding from foundations to do it. But I think it's a model for how to implement these kinds of approaches more widely while continuing to test them. I'm going to stop my share again so I can see the chat. Okay, I'm looking at Lana's question. You know, the study with the ninth graders, I wish I had time to show you the actual video that my guys just submitted. It's very powerful to hear these older students talking about their struggles. You know, I think it has to be done with care to convey the right message that this is something that is common to everyone. And making sure it resonates to the particular setting of the individual school. As I mentioned, the topic that came up most in our school was who you sit with at lunch, which, you know, may not be true in all schools, but it really was powerful.
We've had a number of questions come in, so I'll give them to you one by one.
Okay, sure. Shoot, fire away.
First question, do you know of any studies done with foster kids aging out of foster care?
Oh boy, that's a great question. I don't. And I wish there were some studies because I can imagine that's not an easy transition.
Yes. Another question, what do you think was more impactful for the students, the viewing of the videos or the personal essays they wrote?
Well, it's a good question. And I don't think we really know the answer to that, that almost all of these interventions kind of package them. Um, my hunch is, this idea of seeing is believing, of taking, not just passively hearing a message, but
Mhm.
I have to put it in my own words to tell someone else. My hunch is that's a very powerful part of it. It makes me incorporate it more to communicate it to somebody else.
I was thinking too, it relates to active learning. Like you all
Yeah,
have to have the two, I think.
yeah.
Another question. Do you know of any belonging interventions being done around belonging to groups of people with learning issues?
Not specifically. Um, I'm wondering, I'm pausing because I'm wondering if in the study we did, we could go back and look at that just to see whether there were students who were identified to have learning. I think probably our sample's too small to sort of look at that group separately. But again, it would be a great study to do.
Another question, and there's some great comments in here, so I encourage people to be reading the chat, as I'm sure they are. Another question, though, are there any other belonging interventions beyond the testimonial of older students?
Well, there is something called the College Transition Collaborative that has tried to, actually, it's another example of an attempt to scale up these interventions, where they've tried to take these belonging interventions and scale them up to different colleges around the US. In order to do so, you can't bring people into person easily, so they've done it online, where as part of a student orientation, typically, students get this in an online module. And they've tried various versions of it. And I think they're in the process of sorting. There's a massive amount of data they haven't published much yet, and so I think I worry a little bit that it's too dilute at that point. That students entering college are bombarded with things they have to do to prepare an orientation, and this message I worry may get a little lost if it's part of that as opposed to an in-person intervention. But the jury's still out on that.
Interesting. There are a lot of comments about people that say, like, yes, this sounds great. This is where it could fit in our high school schedule and such. Would you suggest for people wanting to move forward with trying to implement this just to go to those websites you mentioned?
I think that's the best. And the first one, the PERT, if you're at all interested in being part of a research project, I mean, there's a lot of good resources there to how to use this. But what I find particularly exciting about that one is you can actually partner with researchers and be part of a research project. And I think you have to agree to share the de-identified grades with the researchers, so to look at the effectiveness of it. And there are some hurdles you have to jump over to do this, but it's exciting that you can be both implement these things, but also be part of research.
Yeah, a comment that just came in. Lana is wondering if providing students with other outlets to voice their affirmations besides writing an essay would result in higher success. Perhaps most students see writing an essay as a task, and that could deter some.
Yeah. As I mentioned, I think the values affirmation approach is exciting, but maybe the least understood. And so the short answer is we don't know. But I think, I'd be curious to know what your ideas are for other outlets. I do think it has to remind the student, at least the theory says, it has to remind the students that all their self-esteem eggs aren't in this one basket, that they're someone who there are important things in their lives. School's one of them, but there are other things that are really important to them. And there probably are ways to accomplish that other than these essays.
Yeah. Another question that just came in, were the value affirmation writing activities shared amongst their peers? Especially in middle school, students tend to be private, and I'm curious if the activity will still be impactful if kept private.
No, good question. They were not. It was just private. And one of the reasons for that was a methodological one, that they wanted within one classroom, they wanted to randomly assign some kids to do the essays and some to the control group. And so that way people sort of did it to themselves and didn't tell their classmates which group they were in.
This has me personally wondering, because I'm a grade 2 teacher, like what types of narratives and stories could I help the children with at that young age to prepare them for the transition to high school and the transition to college? Do you have any thoughts?
Grade 2, you said?
Yeah.
It's a great question. And it's interesting. There's very little research with younger kids. And, again, my hunch is that these kind of interventions work the best at times of transition, when you're entering high school, you're entering college. But starting school as a kindergartner or first or second grader is a big transition.
Mm-hmm.
And, obviously kids aren't as quite sophisticated thinkers at that age, but, I'm sure they're making, stories are forming as to what school means to them. What kind of environment is this? Is it a welcoming place for me? And so I think I'd love to see some studies done there. But, as a teacher, just trying to emphasize to kids that struggles are common, I remember my son got locked in the bathroom his first day of kindergarten. And it was like this traumatic thing. And he came home and said, well, this doesn't mean school's like this is going to be like this for your whole time. And to avoid them personalizing these struggles is really the key.
Yeah, I'm thinking in particular what you said about, your self-esteem eggs aren't all in this basket. And I think that's a message you could start young.
Mm-hmm.
And then also so much of this seems just to be like normalizing experiences. Even in second grade, you can feel left out. Well, let's talk about that. That's a common feeling, and that doesn't define who you are, and you won't always feel that way.
Sure. I'm sure this has been all the worse in the pandemic era of trying to deal with kids in many situations from home. It's not been easy, I'm sure.
Lana says she also sees a value in showing students testimonies that college is not the only way to find success. That some students need to hear they can be successful in vocational education as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Vonda commented, they're faculty of color and a PWI. They just conducted an anti-racist presentation using a roundtable discussion method with students only. The students were of all races and it was highly successful. It was a testimonial that had no faculty intervention, aside from selecting the student presenters, and was highly successful according to the students and staff.
Very interesting, Vonda. Thank you for sharing that. It reminds me in Charlottesville that at our high school, we've had some anti-racist groups emerging from students and all the way up to the school board from students, which has been really exciting. Again, I will say as the sort of cold scientist that I do think we need to test any of these programs. And the one you described sounds wonderful. I'm a little wary of some other sort of implicit bias approaches that are supposed to be magical fixes when I think they're often not. But that's a whole nother discussion of what effective interventions are for to combat racism. Getting adults out of the way. I'm reading the chat. That can be important.
Daniel asked if you can say more about the limitations of implicit bias.
Well, it's a long conversation, but I worry that, I've done some research in this area myself, and I worry that we've conveyed the message that implicit bias training can just erase racism easily. Many of you probably remember the incident at Starbucks a couple of years ago where there was a racist treatment of two guys in Philadelphia who were just sitting there, and the police were called. And as a result, Starbucks closed all their stores for a day to give people implicit bias training. And, there's nothing wrong with that, except if we assume we solved the problem magically. And 400 years of history of racism in this country, I don't think can be erased with an hour's intervention. I do think there are things we can do, and that's the topic of another talk. But just don't assume it's easy. I'm reading the comments. The tried and true principle in social psychology is contact under the right conditions, bringing hostile groups together, having interactions where there's true equality and interdependence. There's in education, there are cooperative learning techniques that have proved to be successful in the classroom where you mix groups and you make them interdependent and cooperative. I'm a fan of that approach. Jigsaw classroom, some of you may be familiar with that term. But yeah, we need to work hard at this.
It struck me when you just commented, a 1 hour intervention is not going to change that, which is true. And yet in the other studies you mentioned,
yes,
1 hour intervention.
Well, it's true, and it sounds inconsistent, but I think in these story editing interventions, the key is changing a story that can be self-perpetuating, and that you can go out into your life and find evidence that supports this story, which strengthens it and makes it a self-enhancing cycle. And I think that's just harder with these implicit bias. They're not really designed to do that. They're meant to change a habit but we haven't figured out how to duplicate that approach with implicit racism yet, put it that way.
Yeah, and what it was making me think of is not just that sounds inconsistent, but that shows the necessity of actually testing it with a randomized control trial. Yes. You can't make these generalizations.
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
All right, well, we have 1 minute left. So if there are any pressing questions, ask now. Any last comments, Dr. Wilson?
I don't think so. It's just that I have the greatest admiration for those of you out there teaching and especially in this pandemic. It's been really difficult, but let's all hope that we're coming out of it and things will improve soon.
Yes. Well, we thank you so much for your time and, as Daniel says, your devotion to this work.
Well, thank you, everybody. And great to see you all.
Thank you so much.